Welcome back to the show. Please enjoy Episode 3, Davia. I'm Chris Wyden, and this is Leviathan Rising.
Hello, citizens! It's another day in the American Republic, and despite what our former demon-riddled brothers in the West might say, the Union is strong. The President returned to Chicago today after trade negotiations with the Canadian leadership that have been called historic. He is scheduled to make a televised press conference from the White House within the hour to address the nation. We anticipate the unveiling of a new trade deal that the administration has described coyly to the press as robust and exciting.
Davia Dominguez woke up on her 75th birthday feeling like she was 75. This was not readily apparent to Davia as she pulled herself out of bed. She looked across the expanse of her much-too-large mattress, slipping into the robe Lawrence had left hanging from the bedpost. This room is too big for me, thought Davia. Or maybe I'm just getting smaller. Downstairs, Lawrence greeted Davia with trademark cheer. Good morning, good morning! Oof, big eye roll, thought Davia, the edge of her lips curling into the briefest smile. An image of Nicolas Cage sparked in her mind. A meme from before, as people would say now. What was the joke in the meme, though? Thought Davia. Big eye roll? That doesn't seem right. Happy birthday to you. Davia looked up in surprise. Lawrence was approaching from the fridge with a stack of pancakes. Protruding from the top of this bready ordeal was an alarming number of lit candles. Lawrence finished his birthday ballad on a deep note, grinning as he set the plate in front of the fresh 75-year-old judge. Do you feel 75 today? Davia answered by giving him steady eye contact as she blew out the candles. It's what people say, said Lawrence with a hint of sass. Davia smiled and thanked him. Big breakfasts were never her thing, but what the hell. Pancakes have been a special treat until recently, too. Davia sunk her fork into the spongy discs. Pancakes, limited time, screamed the sign from a shabby restaurant window. Rain droplets streamed down Davia's car window. The city was always dark and foggy when it rained now, even during the day. This apparently had something to do with the density of so-called forever chemicals that were now permanently part of the atmosphere in rain clouds. Davia watched from her backseat passenger window as people flitted past the little cafe. After months of rationed flour, bread was back and bountiful. The president had announced a new trade deal with Canada earlier in the week that would increase the availability of essentials again. Bread rations one week, bread sales the next. Food insecurity had never been so erratic, but as long as there was order. As long as there's order, Davia's mind rotated the half-thought in her head absently, like a novice might investigate a Rubik's Cube. Can you believe it? Davia's driver flicked his eyes in the rear view, confirming she had heard him. The president announces this trade deal on Monday, and by Thursday we have bread and meat back in Chicago. The government never took action this fast back before. Davia smiled sadly at him through her reply. No, they didn't. She adjusted her seatbelt, loosening it around the waist. Davia was a quiet woman, and much quieter than she had been in her 20s and 30s certainly. She wondered how much that had to do with age versus defeat. The defeated are quiet. Maybe aging is just another form of defeat, she thought as her black car pulled onto the Supreme Court's campus. She had arrived early for the day, per usual. The office of Justice Davia Dominguez was large, but its ornate wood paneling gave her an ominous sensation. She knew all too well that rooms like this aren't built without fucking someone over. As if in response to her thoughts, the edges of the room seemed to slide ever so slightly closer in her peripheral vision as she entered, beckoning darkly to her desk chair. The Justice shuddered. "Morning, Justice." Mark and Maria entered the room with distinctly incongruous levels of enthusiasm. Despite sounding like the two leads on an early 2000s-era sitcom, Maria could not have had a less rosy disposition toward Mark. The newest of Davia's clerks, Mark approached Davia's desk while Maria maneuvered around file boxes to reach the office's sitting area. Like all obnoxious offices, this one had what can best be described as its own little living room. Boxes of legal briefs and opinions were stacked haphazardly around the room in various states of undress. Were it not for the ornate design and furnishings, the space would look more like an abandoned copy store. "The regular?" Mark asked the aging Justice from his post in front of her desk. He reminded her of a young Josh Hawley, and this made Davia dislike him almost more than Maria did. Davia had been in her 20s when Josh Hawley was assassinated, but it felt like a defining crack in the stonework to her. The event and the general cultural anxiety that multiplied and mutated in those final years opened the eyes of every American then. They had to face that existential truth of all dying empires. No one in charge knows what they're doing, and you are not safe. It was only years later that Davia learned the reason behind Hawley's assassination. Maria was wearing a new Harvard sweatshirt, but Mark always arrived wearing a full suit. Davia wondered if that's something they taught at the National University, or if that was just him. The new and official public college of the Republic was the National University where Mark had attended. Davia's mind was already drifting as she gave Mark her coffee order. "The least sweet mocha the shop could muster, please." It was a Friday, which for this court meant that the workday would be easy and slow. But Davia changed nothing about her schedule on any day, especially these days. Behavioral consistency had earned her the trust that few former radicals were granted under the new regime. As a black Latino woman, she gave them a needed legitimacy, or at least a deniability that could be wielded against any claim that the regime had failed to deliver on its promise of equality. And they gave her a charmed existence of material resources afforded to fewer and fewer each year. "No birthday wishes from Mark," Davia noted as he left to get the coffees. "Attentive and professional, but only surface deep." "Maria?" she said. "Yes, Justice?" "You can take the morning off if you like. We can resume at noon." Maria was very thankful for the opportunity. She packed several files in a shoulder bag and exited. Knowing Maria, Davia knew she would just post up at some nearby bar now to read through briefs until noon. Davia sat back in her chair and sighed. Maybe it was because it was her birthday, or just the feeling of age she woke up with today, but Davia couldn't keep her mind from wandering. Her thoughts floated and teleported from times and spaces long forgotten, or apparently long dormant. Davia was 11 years old when she and her mother joined the protests outside of the Supreme Court in 2022 after the Dobbs decision. Davia wasn't old or mature enough at the time to grasp what the decision meant, but any child understands rage. She remembers a current of anger that flowed above and through the crowd. She had never seen so many women gather together in one place, and she certainly had never seen such unbridled fury. Maybe a younger child would have found this frightening, but Davia found the environment invigorating. She was old enough to understand that what permeated the air around her was anger, but she was also aware that it wasn't about her. She understood that this anger had a reason. This rage was somehow good. And more importantly, though she didn't grasp its importance at the time, Davia felt the fear that licked at the corners of this crowd's collective rage. This was different than being scared of the dark. This was a kind of fear that was palpable. She felt it pressing against the balls of her feet, sweating out of the palms of her hands, and pulsing in her temples. Children often understand their feelings better than adults on an intuitive level, and in that way, Davia understood that this fear represented a terrible power. Like a spinning reel, Davia's mind dashed and tumbled into her adulthood. She was in her mid-20s, taking a cop's fist to the nose. Now an anger and fear with which she was all too familiar coursed through her. She barely even registered her broken nose as she howled the crowd's chant back into the faces of her assailants. "Housing is a human right," followed by everyone's favorite refrain, "All cops are bastards." Davia and her compadres took plenty of hits that day, but they had a system for the skirmish that facilitated breaks and recovery time for each protester. This was a tactic developed in the 2020s, and it allowed protesters to sustain longer assaults from the police. The protesters were divided into 2 waves, first wave and second wave. Each protester was paired with someone in a different wave from themselves. The first wave acted as the front line to face police, and then one by one, each protester would swap with their second wave partner. This only worked when protest groups were above a certain size, but when it was possible, it usually worked. The cops threw everything they had at the protesters, but the protesters took breaks to recover and receive first aid. In effect, the protesters were playing with a first and second string, but the cops only had their starting players. And that day, no one got evicted. And then, like a flipping coin, Davia's mind landed inside the halls of power. She remembered clerking for Justice Kaplan, the Supreme Court's first and last Filipino-American justice. The long nights reading briefs. Davia wistfully thought about debating the finer points of constitutional law with Kaplan and her other clerks. Usually Kaplan agreed with her, but Kaplan waffled whenever she had to state who she agreed with, to make the other clerks feel valued. Davia remembered the soft sound of papers rustling and inky pens making surgical cuts in the margins of various jurisprudential texts. Even then, she knew that law was her passion, a place where she could effect change in the bones of a law-ruled society and indulge in those human comforts that only grow more appealing with age. Age. Davia's mind danced into her time on the federal bench. It's amazing to think that, of all the country-ending calamities that pundits predicted might deal a death blow to the United States Empire, no one had seriously considered what a massive solar flare might do. In 48 hours, the electrical grid of every country went down. Many power stations in the former United States used circuit breakers that hadn't been updated for decades, but they still prevented the worst from happening. Most of the grid went down instantly as power lines fried, but lead batteries allowed roughly a day for many power stations to begin troubleshooting before they too were plunged into darkness. Suddenly, every essential electrical system from those at hospitals to train stations to the internet were gone. Not forever, but without notice. People couldn't get the news, so rumors spread quickly as to the cause. And after a few days, clean water wasn't coming out of the tap anymore. Every electricity-dependent transportation method was defunct. Older cars with lead batteries returned to the streets where folks still had them after a little while. It took weeks to months for the country to come back online altogether, but the DC area and other major government facilities quickly got gas and oil power sources working again. The DC area was lit back up in less than a week. But even so, something major changed. Across the country, whole states lost control of the communities that made them up. As more time passed without hearing any news from the state or federal authorities, communities all over began to assume and create their own independent power structures, each under their own authority. This was the beginning of the transition, as the American Republic would later dub it. But this major change wasn't only about the wider crumbling of the American geopolitical structure. It was also about the federal political structure itself. Somehow, at some point during the 5 days between the solar flare and the power grid coming back on in DC, a new government took the reins. In the confusion, the country hardly noticed as one president resigned and another took his place. Members of the DC class were aware, but they were not a class of action. The country didn't know, and so there was no push from constituents to take action. And so that congressional class watched silently and fearfully as a new administration formed. They kept watching as this turned into a new type of regime, continually testing its boundaries and expanding its powers when meaningful resistance failed to meet it. Davia's mind rewound a bit. Davia thought about the weekend she moved to Chicago. She had been promoted to a position in the 7th Circuit, which wouldn't start for another few weeks, but she decided to move early. This was mostly because of what the news was calling the hurricane trifecta that was climbing northward from the Atlantic and Caribbean. 3 storms were predicted to collide with the southern and eastern coastlines all in the same week, and given the damage hurricanes had started delivering then, Davia thought it was best to have everything shipped out before she could sell her house. It turned out to be the right choice, but she did lose that house. "Ma'am?" A falsely timid Mark stood in her doorway, proffering a mocha. Davia waved at him to come inside. Mark was always a little weaselly, but something felt off today. He was behaving like he had an itch in a private place, an irritation or unmet urge that he was trying to endure rather than scratch. Davia thanked him for the mocha, and then told him he could go for the day. It was Friday after all, and her office was ahead of their own schedule as it was. Mark seemed unsure about his newfound freedom. This might have been adorable were it his first day, but Mark had been with her for months now, and his visible uneasiness gave Davia pause. She offered Mark assurance that this would be perfectly acceptable, and after some wordless stammering, Mark took his leave. Davia took a sip of her mocha and looked up with surprise as security entered her office. If anyone, she would have expected Lawrence, her personal security, and near-constant companion when she was away from the court. But this wasn't Lawrence. It was Paul Salazar. Paul worked security at the court itself, but it was not typical for him to pay the justices a visit. "Paul," Davia said, "it's a surprise to see you today. Anything I can help you with?" Paul's demeanor was awkward as he closed the office door behind him. Davia put her mocha down instinctively. "Paul?" she asked with growing concern. Paul looked up at her, an apology on his face. He looked sincere. "Justice, I'm sorry, but your number's been called." Davia rested her hands lightly on her desk for a moment. It would have been a lie to say that she had never considered this eventuality. It was remarkable her tenure had lasted this long under the current regime anyway. But after her recent slew of dissents, she understood why they were making their move now. She looked at her drink. "Is it in the mocha?" she asked, with a cool tone that surprised even her a little bit. "No," Paul said. "It'll be quicker than that." As he said this, Paul produced a pistol with a silencer already attached. Strangely, Davia felt a pang of sympathy for Mark. Clearly, he had known that this was coming, but also hadn't been chosen to be her ultimate assassin. His waffling and awkward exit today therefore meant he had a kind of remorse for knowing what his leaving would mean for the justice. She smiled briefly. And then, "Wait, what about Lawrence? Is this not something he could take care of tonight while I sleep?" Davia was sincere with this suggestion, but she understood that it would not be seen that way. And as if reading her mind, Paul shook his head from side to side. He then took his first steps forward, now raising his weapon, approaching the desk. Davia closed her eyes for a moment to center herself, and then she raised her gaze to look Paul in the eyes. As she steadied her focus, the door behind Paul opened quietly, and Lawrence appeared. She watched as Paul turned his attention behind him. He only managed to spin partway around when Lawrence's bullet split into his skull right above the right ear. But unlike Paul, Lawrence was not using a silencer, so this was incredibly loud. With the ringing in her ears, Davia couldn't even hear Paul's body thud on the ground. Grateful and terrified, she looked up at Lawrence with tears in her eyes. And then behind him, Davia saw Maria standing in the doorway. A to-go cup lay next to her on the floor with brown liquid pooling around it. Lawrence followed Davia's gaze to Maria, and then he turned back to Davia. "Okay, well, we have to go. Now." As Davia stood, Lawrence directed his words to Maria. "And you're coming too." Thank you for listening to Leviathan Rising. If you're enjoying the show, please rate us on your podcast app. It's a huge help. To keep up with us online, our social media accounts are linked in the episode description. If you want to send us a note, our email is in there too. Leviathan Rising is created by Chris Wyden. Music is composed and produced by Travis Paul.